Hi, this is Hanegraaff, president of the Christian Research Institute and host of the Bible Answer Man broadcast with another Hank Unplugged short. I don't know how short this one is going to be because the prophecy pundits are at it again. I was flying to Washington, D.C., and I heard the statements of some modern-day prophecy pundits with respect to what's happening in the Ukraine. And as I was listening, I once again recognized how important it is for us to understand the matter of semantics. Semantics is the science of meaning. So when Ezekiel mentions the word rosh, the imaginations of end-time sensationalists, well, they just go wild. Rosh sounds enough like Russia to implicate Russia as the villain in sensationalistic end-time scenarios. Now, I'm not commenting here on geopolitical realities. This is not a commentary on what's going on in Ukraine. My comments are meant to communicate just how horrifying it is to misunderstand the sacred words of Scripture. And what I'm talking about is nothing new. Prophecy pundits have been doing this forever. They have made the word rosh, meaning in their vernacular, Russia. They've made this an argument that's become a pillar in sensationalistic end-time speculation. I think of Mark Hitchcock. He interprets rosh as a proper noun referring to a very specific place, Russia. But let me put it plainly, the word Russia is not a derivation of rosh. Credible historians and linguists have for years pointed out the reality that the word Russia is it's an 11th-century Viking word, and as such should not be semantically linked to the Hebrew word rosh. As should be obvious, semantics makes a great deal of difference. If we misunderstand the semantics of Scripture, we misunderstand the biblical text. But even more, if we misunderstand the history of the Bible, we can come up with all kinds of sensationalistic scenarios. I was listening to Pat Robertson, who was talking about Putin and saying Putin was out of his mind, and that may be true, but so is Pat Robertson. Robertson said that Putin is being compelled by God to go into Ukraine, but that his ultimate goal is to move against Israel. Well, how's he come up with this? He cites Ezekiel and says that Putin, on the basis of the prophet Ezekiel in the Bible, is going to link up with Turkey across a land bridge, and that this is a setup for Ezekiel chapter 38, that Ukraine is the key because it's the land bridge between Bulgaria, Greece, and Turkey. And that all of that area is going to be mobilized against Israel in these days. So he tells us to look at a map, to read the newspaper, to listen to the news, and then to know of a fact that God is bringing to pass what he prophesied years ago through Ezekiel. And once again tells us to go to Ezekiel chapter 38. I suppose you can go to Ezekiel chapter 39 as well. And he says it's all there. that God is getting ready to do something amazing, which is the fulfillment of prophecy. It's all coming to pass, he says. But what's the problem here? The problem is a failure to understand the historical context of any given book in the Bible. As a result, those like Pat Robertson, like prophecy pundits in general, have very little hope of grasping the meaning of the biblical text. Let me put that another way. If you want to properly evaluate biblical texts, you have to understand their historical context. And the book of Ezekiel is a great example. Remember this. Ezekiel was prophesying during an extremely dark period in the history of Judah. He was born into the priesthood in Jerusalem, well, right about the time that Josiah found the book of the law in the temple. This was a time in which spiritual renewal had broken out in the land. But unfortunately, the Reformation was short-lived. By the time of Josiah's death, the idolatrous practices of the past had returned with a vengeance, and thus the axe of God's judgment fell. Now, by the way, the axe of God's judgment falling certainly applies to many epochs in history, perhaps even to ours. At any rate, as a result of the axe of God's judgment falling, Ezekiel found himself on the dusty plains of Babylon. And there he was warning fellow exiles that the worst lay right around the corner. We all know from history that in 586, Jerusalem and its golden temple were desecrated and manifestly destroyed. But here's the point. Without the historical backdrop, we'd be hard-pressed to understand Ezekiel's words. Remember this, Ezekiel was prophesying from the dusty environs of a refugee camp in the south of Babylon near the Kebar River. And there he looked into the eastern sky, and he was longing for the glory of the Lord to return to a temple that had vanished in the rocks that surrounded it. He yearned for the promise of a temple whose glory would exceed even that of Solomon's temple. And in the spirit, he was looking forward to events that were going to take place a generation later. Not the 21st century, but a generation later. A generation later when Zerubbabel would rebuild the spiritual condition of the returning exiles. When Nehemiah would challenge his fellow countrymen to arise and rebuild the shattered walls of Jerusalem. The historical principle of biblical interpretation will keep you from supposing, as do modern prophecy pundits, that Ezekiel longed for a third or fourth temple when the second had not as yet arisen from the ashes of the first. The principles of Scripture are inviolate, but it is a great travesty to take a word like rosh and say rosh means Russia. Again, the word Russia is an 11th century Viking word and not semantically linked in the least to the Hebrew word rosh. So semantics is important. We need to understand the principles of biblical interpretation so that our modern day imaginations don't go wild, which oftentimes leads to stoking not just present-day wars, but wars in the future as well. Thanks for tuning in.